Hello and welcome to Sunday Run Day, the podcast. On this week's episode, I'm excited to be joined by Nick. Now, Nick is the lead sports scientist at Met's Performance Consulting. So first of all, Nick, thank you for taking time out to join the show.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
No, it's great. So I wanted to talk a little bit about obviously what you do at Met's Performance Consulting, and then we'll dive deeper into those few things us runners like to know about, our VO2 max and lactate threshold. So just at Met's Performance Consulting, all the testing that you do there, how do you do the testing and what do you test?
Yeah, so a lot of our testing is physiology based. So we're largely runners, cyclists, triathletes. Ultra distance runners is a really popular one, but a lot of it surrounds, of course, VO2 max. That's probably the big buzz number that most people want to see and know. But then a lot of our work really is developing or understanding where your thresholds are at. What does that then mean for training zones? And then ultimately, what can we draw from the data to then implement to your training to improve how effective your program is? So do you need a bit more high intensity work? Where is zone 2 and what does that actually mean for you as a heart rate or a pace target? What can we draw out of some of the data to maybe suggest a pacing strategy for a marathon or a half marathon? So there's a lot that we can really start to dig into just outside of just VO2 max. And I kind of joke often, like for someone who tests VO2 max all the time, that's sometimes the last number I look at. But it is definitely still an interesting one. But yeah, we sort of cover all bases in terms of trying to understand someone's physiology from a performance standpoint, and then how can we go about improving it?
No, that's awesome. And yeah, as you say, like, you're trying to get that improvement in their training into maybe pacing strategy and stuff like that can come from all that testing that we do. So I say, touching on VO2 max, is us as runners, most of our listeners, we all have a Garmin, and the Garmin tells us what our VO2 max roughly is. So what is VO2 max is probably the first question I'd ask, just for people to understand. And obviously, how is it measured? But also, how can we improve our VO2 max?
Yeah, so to start with, VO2 max really, and like by definition, it's the maximum amount of oxygen that you can really take in. So breathe in through your lungs, transport through your cardiovascular system, and then utilize at the muscles per minute. So it just sets up, I always like thinking about it as like, what is the size of your aerobic engine? If you're a really top end high performance athlete, you're going to have a big, maybe like a V10 or a V12 engine, like big size engine, big VO2 max. You can do a lot with it. Maybe an amateur runner, probably not as big. And like in comparisons, it's your F1 car versus your road car, right? Like the average person's probably going to have that road car engine, and they can do a lot with it, but it's just sort of a starting point. It gives you an ability to do what you want to. At the top end, it's sort of a ticket to entry to those high performances. Someone who wants to run a low 2-hour marathon is going to have quite a high VO2 max, but it's not the only thing. It depends then on the length of event that you're training for, etc. But it really just sort of gives us an understanding of what at an absolute maximal level can you do aerobically. And then from there, we can sort of distinguish, well, how do you get to that point? Is that because you've got really good oxygen kinetics, so you can get your oxygen consumption up really quickly and you're really good at the high intensity, short stuff? Or are you someone who's really good from an aerobic base perspective and maybe really economical? So you don't need a lot of oxygen to go really fast. The context around that also becomes important. So I think for the average runner, it's really just understanding, what can I actually do at the moment? If I really push myself as hard as I can, all this training I've been doing, what is the output? And then from there, like, where do we need to channel that output? Do we need to try and make you a little bit more durable, more economical? Do we need a bigger size engine for what we want to do? The specificity really starts to be quite individualized around what are you training for? What are your goals? What are your pace goals that you might be looking for? But the VO2 max is definitely kind of that starting piece. It's like, if you've got a big engine, generally it means we can channel that into a lot of different directions.
Yeah, as you say, it's kind of judging on what you're going to do and what you want to achieve. If you're going to out there running low 2-hour marathons, you're going to have that big engine, have that big VO2 max. But if you're there, wanting to just get a little bit extra on your marathon runs, maybe close to 3 hours, 3.5 hours, or 4, then you're trying to work. You can work on to actually improve on that and get there. So yeah, I do really like that. What your description of that. Yeah, you're kind of describing it, as we say, high power engine, low power engine. And we're kind of, as amateur athletes, we probably have that, run of the mill normal engine that is in most cars, but we want to improve on the VO2 max. And then just for us to get improvement on that, is it more about that sort of high intensity training that would add into it as we're sort of, doing our long runs as well and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think for the vast majority of sort of amateur runners, most of us are pretty good at going out and doing the long, easy Ks, right? Like that's pretty intuitive. If you're going to go and do a half marathon or a marathon is a good example, it's like you're going to rack up the volume and you sort of intuitively know that I've got to go and do a big long run. So that will have some contribution. But what do we tend to see in the lab and from testing and some of the patterns in the data we see is that more often than not, and I won't say all the time, but more often than not, that missing piece is probably a bit more of the high intensity interval work or that really top end sort of aerobic power, shorter, sharper kind of training. So that will really stimulate that ability to use oxygen quite quickly. And that added into a program's often that driver to take things up to the next level. Generally speaking, you can get a pretty good VO2 max off that lower intensity, moderate intensity work, but to really take it up another notch. And I think the comparison would be, if you were a mid-pack sort of runner and you wanted to bring yourself up to the top third or the top quarter of your age group, that element of high intensity training is often a differential. So those who just go out and run pretty consistently, low to moderate intensity, maybe a threshold, you can have a pretty good size engine and build a fair bit in there. But at some point, and kind of logically too, at some point, if you want to run fast, you've got to challenge yourself to run a bit quicker. And part of that process is really challenging that upper end, your VO2 max. So that's where your 800 meter reps on the track or 600s, 400s, there's a multitude of different kinds of sessions you can throw in there to get that stimulus, but that higher intensity effort is really effective. And it's often what gets talked about a lot. In terms of some of the research around that high intensity interval training as a method, really, really effective, quite time effective in terms of its structure, but it's a very specific stimulus. It's really close to that VO2 max intensity. So that's how we end up getting that really good bang for buck out of that session.
No, that's awesome. And I love that as well, as you say, touching on of getting on that 800, 600, 400, whatever could be on the track to really get that high intensity up and really working on that. And I guess just a little question, just as we're talking about the improvement of VO2 max, when you talk about that high intensity training, are we looking at like the Norwegian types of training? Because we see a lot of that. We see that they do that, 4x4, really trying to push themselves, and they get a lot of benefit from that. And, myself, I've read a few studies around about their strategies. Is that something that really can implement and improve us as we sort of train a little bit more?
Yeah, I think raising the 4x4 is an interesting one because that in the lab comes up as a topic of conversation for those who are chasing performances, but those who are then maybe on that health longevity sort of path too of just trying to be a bit fitter overall. I go, it's a great example of a session. Like I just said though, like there's so many different ways to get there, but the actual important part of this is how do we maximize time at VO2 max in a training session? That's the actual stimulus we're looking for. So a really good example, there's a study done on cyclists a number of years ago where they took the VO2 max of a bunch of sort of reasonable level cyclists, not elite, but like pretty solid level of performance, probably mid to upper end amateur. And they said, go and do a time to exhaustion test on the bike just below VO2 max. So we're going to try and get you to that maximal oxygen consumption, but bring the pace of a touch so you can sustain it for as long as you can. And I think on average, they lasted somewhere between 11 to 14 minutes of time. And within that, they accumulated about 6 minutes. They were measuring their oxygen consumption throughout. Yeah. Accumulated about 6 minutes of time at VO2 max. So you go, well, in theory, could I just go out and go as flat out as I can for 8, 10, 11 minutes and just burn myself in one and get 4 or 5 minutes of time at VO2 max? In theory, yes. Yeah. They then compared it to, and this is where just interval training in general, that high intensity interval training works, is they then compared that to 30 on 30 offs. So they said, what we're going to do now is take those same cyclists, we're going to develop this 30 on 30 off protocol and measure their oxygen consumption. And the goal was, again, to go time to exhaustion. You just rep these 30 on 30 offs as long as you can until you can't maintain that workload anymore in the on effort. And essentially what they saw is, on average, they were lasting like 40 minutes. Right. Like, and there's no reason for you to necessarily go out and try and do 30 on 30 offs for 40 minutes. This was a study to just prove the effectiveness. But again, they measured time at VO2 max and it's significantly longer. because they were able to maintain that workload. Like the initial part, if you look at the oxygen uptake, that single consistent effort time to exhaustion test, oxygen consumption comes up and it maintains, obviously, because we're still working, but then you fatigue quite quick. The on and offs, a little bit slower in the initial uptake, but what they found is as they kept repping out 30 on, 30 off again and again, what they saw is even in the off periods, they're still blowing and breathing pretty hard. They're replicating that VO2 max like stimulus, that eventually their oxygen consumption just stayed up, and that accumulation of time at VO2 max really significantly increased. So as a result, it's like if you were comparing those two individual sessions, well, the 30 on, 30 off is more effective. Not to say then that's better or worse than 4 on, 4 off. I think there's utility in different types of the interval, but I think it's important to understand, it's like, well, we do this to maximize time at VO2 max.
Yeah.
So I look at something like a 4x4 and to kind of come full circle. Most of the lower level beginner to intermediate athlete that I'd see in the lab, I probably would steer away from a 4x4 because 4 minutes flat out pretty much is a hard enough effort as it is. But if you're still trying to build the foundations, that's going to be a really grueling session. And I think on the topic of like compliance to session, being able to complete it, have a sense of achievement that you'll come back and do it again next week and the week after, and have that building consistency, probably a lot harder to achieve really well at a 4x4. But 2 on, 2 off, probably a bit more achievable. And if that means we can get more consistency, you'll still get the same stimulus. We just have to manipulate, well, what are you doing in the recovery? What are you doing in the on effort? How fast are you going there to get the same effect? Someone who's a bit more advanced, a 4x4 is far more appropriate because 2 on, 2 off is probably far too easy. So there's levers we can pull. And then even an external to that is things like work to rest ratio become interesting. You could take a quite well-trained athlete and 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off as an example, probably a pretty easy session. They recover quite quick. We get too much drop in their oxygen consumption in the rest period. But if you give them 2 on, 1 off at the right on intensity, that becomes significantly harder. Less rest time, less time for oxygen consumption to drop, so they get back up to near VO2 max quicker. And that might actually be a much more stimulating session for them. So we've changed the dynamic, not through how fast you're running, not through the length of the effort, not through maybe the number of efforts and the total volume, but purely just manipulating the rest period. And all of that is just filtering into how are we manipulating that time spent at near VO2 max as a like oxygen consumption response. So there's so many different sessions you can do. But I think if you approach it with that mindset of we're trying to replicate what we're like at VO2 max, and this is where, of course, I'm going to advocate the lab testing is useful. It's like, you know where that is based on a test. You can then more easily target that in a training session. You've got a better idea of what the intensity requirements like to do that. But if you approach those sessions with that mindset, you've got a bit more flexibility. You've got more sessions you can now play with. Like you don't feel like you're locked into, oh, I heard that the Norwegians are doing 4x4, so that's the only effective session. Well, it's not. But what you also have to remember is those guys are machines. Like they're unbelievably good athletes. So that type of session is quite it's quite stimulating for them at that high level, because something like a 2 on, 2 off is probably not stimulating enough. It's that interesting dynamic. So I think if you think about it in terms of trying to maximize time at VO2 max, a really good guide there is in any of those sessions, if you monitor your heart rate and across each effort, you're gradually seeing a bit of drift in your heart rate. So that might be, let's say we did 2 minute efforts and the first effort got to 180 beats per minute, and then effort 2 you peaked at 183, and then effort 4 you peaked at 188. If you're seeing something like that, often that's a pretty good sign that we're getting a stimulus that we were targeting or trying to get to. So I go, whether you're doing 30 on, 30 off, you're doing 4x4, 5x5, you do a 4 minute effort, 2 3s and then 2 2s, like that classic like 1200, 800, 600 kind of session on the track, right? They're all going to be able to provide a stimulus, but as long as you're then working at the appropriate intensity for the appropriate length of time with the appropriate recovery protocol and the appropriate number of efforts, you get that combination right. Like there's, as I said, there's hundreds of different types of sessions that you could do that will all end up being about the same in terms of their result. There'll be a couple of little differences here and there, but if we're purely just looking at enhancing VO2 max, that they can all have a very similar effect.
And like you say, that comes from, the testing as well, like having that testing and understanding where you're at of what you need to be able to keep at that high intensity. And you say too much rest and you're not going to improve on your VO2 max, but too much high intensity, you're not going to want to go back and do it again. You might go and do that 1 week and you're just like, you know what, I felt absolutely done on that. It's not something I want to do. Whereas if I bring it down, like you say, maybe a 2x2, it's like, yeah, that was really challenging, but I'm excited to go back and do it again and try and have that repetition that we want to get into. And as you touched on there as well about heart rate. And I'd love to just talk a little bit about heart rate and training. A lot of us, I would say, we read about a lot of things, zone 1, zone 2, all of this sort of different zones of heart rate. Obviously, how does that help us when we're training to obviously keep our heart rate, not necessarily at that lower level, but at that steady level, just as we're doing that some of that high intensity training?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one with zones. Like obviously the popularity of using zones for various things has always sort of been there, but probably more so now. Like it gets talked about quite mainstream that if you're not using some form of zone, like you're almost in the minority now. All it really is, again, like fun base principles, like it's just intensity regulation. We're trying to just provide a framework of what to target in certain sessions. So, and I think that's another important one of if you're doing some of your own research, you're just doing some Googling, you're reading some blog articles, listening to podcasts, like there's so many different ways you can set up these zones. But ultimately they all kind of mean the same thing. It's just really what makes sense for you. What can you understand and then apply really effectively? So if I think about realistically, there's kind of 3 key areas, and that's probably the most simplified version of zones is like a 3-zone model.
Yep.
Below your first lactate threshold, if you like, between the thresholds and then above. They're kind of your 3 as a split. You can manipulate that into a 5, and we could go on and on about how many different systems I see or try and map to different athletes' likings. But really, that in that sort of simple format, like 3 zones really nice for the athlete and person who's just like, I just want things simple. I want to know what I need to do when I go hard. I want to know what I need to do when I go easy. And what does like a tempo threshold look like? Like, cool, break it down nice and simple. And the only reason we do separate those is we can't go hard all the time, right? Like, if you tried to go out as hard as you could every run all the time, it might work in the very short term. So take someone who's never run before and no idea of how hard they can actually push, etc. If you're running 3 times a week, like you've probably got enough rest period between that. If you're only running 5Ks a session, like, yeah, cool. You probably can go pretty hard most days and get away with it. The more you train though, and you add extra runs in the week and more volume, it just gets harder. So at some point we need to find a balance of intensity with the duration or kilometers we're racking up and the total volume there to allow us to repeat it again and again and actually then build on what we've done previously. And so for something like zone 2 that often gets popularly talked about, and to be clear, zone 2 in a 5-zone system, in that 3 that I just mentioned, it would actually be sort of the first sort of zone. But that low intensity, if you're going and just running pretty easy, and this is where it's confusing for people, like you start running, you could go and run what actually is probably a bit more sub-threshold or tempo without knowing, and you'll get some good effect, right? Because at that start of the development phase, you develop quite quick, and it's all very similar aerobic adaptation. It's still a 20, 30, 40-minute run. You're going to get some similar adaptation there. The only reason you would stick in that zone 2, though, as you progress is, all right, well, again, we can't go hard all the time. So what is going to keep us that fraction lower, a little bit easier for us, means the fatigue level is a little bit less, the calorie expenditure is a little bit less, so you're not just running low on fuel all the time. But that'll actually allow us, because it's a bit easier, to accumulate more volume. So that just serves as a guide at that point to go, how could I take my training week from 30Ks a week to 50Ks a week? Well, I've probably got to back the intensity off a touch at times, but that actually means I could get an extra half an hour here or an extra hour there, an extra 5K spread across the week, whatever it might look like, and gradually build. Again, if you sort of understand zones as just a means to distribute what the training looks like and give that session a bit of purpose, it also means you know where to target from a intensive session. Like if you think about the other way, like, oh, well, I want to try and work on my VO2 max, or high intensity interval training is the way to do it. I've probably got to spend some time zone 4, zone 5, for example. Or if I'm trying to really work on my muscular endurance and I've got to build up for this 50K ultra, you're going to have to spend a lot of time in that lower intensity domain to build the volume. So it's just a guiding principle. Probably my last point on that is I think a lot of people do very much get obsessive over the zone models though. And to the point of, if you're doing a zone 2 run and the intent's a zone 2 run and easy aerobic and accumulate your Ks, if you spend 30 seconds or a minute above zone 2 because you had to run up a little incline, it doesn't actually matter. You just don't want to spend long periods of time, right? So as long as you approach it practically and you don't take it too rigid and down the line, I think you're going to be okay with understanding how that implements. But yeah, that's probably one of the dangers I see people fall into, is just being a bit too pedantic with the zones. Like, use it as that intensity regulator and a guide, but don't obsess over seconds or minutes that you're like, oh, I wasn't quite in that right zone for 100% of the session. It's like, well, yeah, there's various circumstances where that might not be something you can achieve or needs to happen. So it's okay.
No, I appreciate you sharing that as well. I say for me, myself, I'm not a runner that necessarily runs in zones. I know when I'm feeling like I'm an easy run. Today's an easy run, so I won't pay attention to my heart rate zones because I know that I'm not pushing the intensity. But then when I will go out and do some of those track work, and I know I'm pushing the intensity, so the chances are that my heart rate is going to improve and it's going to be up there higher in that zone 4, zone 5. But I like what you touched on as well, is I don't get kind of really bogged down into thinking I need to stay in that zone, because it is relative. You go out on a run, you might have a hill to come up, and as that hill comes up, you push a little bit harder to get over that sort of hump of the hill, and then you might jump into a zone 3 just for a minute, 2 minutes or something. But yeah, not to kind of be bogged down on that, to kind of have it there. Yes, you want to be around that zone because you do want to be keeping that heart rate down on that easy run, but knowing that it's okay if you just do have a little bit that you go over. It's the overall around the run. And as you're going out for those longer runs, you're there for, maybe you're there for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours. That, yeah, you're going to have a little bit of variation as you kind of get tired and as you dip and stuff like that. So I appreciate you giving a little insight into the heart rate zones there. And then just to touch on as well, like you mentioned there, is about the lactate threshold is another thing that we do see on our Garmin as well. Our Garmin tells us roughly what our lactate threshold. But just to talk a little bit about what it actually is and what it kind of means to some of us. Because I know some people I speak to about lactate threshold, they're like, I don't understand it. What does it actually mean? So I'd love to hear it from your perspective of knowing so much more about it.
Yeah, so I think from a threshold standpoint, I mean, in the lab we use that to help distribute and set up our training zone. So there's really 2 lactate thresholds. So I don't want to confuse people just yet being like, oh, I only thought there was 1 on my watch. Like, so there's 2, but the one that you watch, if we start with that, the one that you watch is going to tell you is probably the threshold that most people, like, if you say the word threshold to a runner, they're referring to that marker. And for the typical amateur, it's going to roughly be your kind of 10K pace, right? It's what can you somewhat hold for 40 to 60 minutes. And I use a broad range. You go 20 minutes, yeah, it's a broad range. Well, it depends how fast you are. Like the elite athletes are probably running half marathons at threshold because of how quick they can run. Whereas the average person who's running a 45, 50-minute 10K is probably running at threshold. So in terms of what it actually is, it's a little tipping point. So when we measure lactate, like across a testing session, we sort of ramp it up, gradually increasing intensities, and we're looking for the point at which lactate production or its entry is equaled by its removal, and what is the last point at which that occurs. So in a testing circumstance, we go through the early intensities. You might not see much change with lactate. We go up 1K an hour, doesn't really change. We then start going up a bit further and it starts increasing a bit quicker. Then it starts increasing really quickly. What that then tells us, so we find that point, the last point before it really starts to rapidly increase typically. What that tells us is, all right, it's a bit of a tipping point for fatigue. So lactate itself is not the fatiguing mechanism. There's what we call hydrogens that come in with lactate. It's the old kind of lactic acid sort of theory, if you like. But that sort of burning sensation you start to feel accumulate, or the heaviness in your legs, is that fatigue byproduct of, we're now starting to work hard. There is going to be a fatigue consequence of that. We need energy turning over quickly. As a result, we pay the price. That threshold point is just the balance point of where can we manage that pretty well and still sustain the workload quite well. And then when we go above it, we know we're going to start fatiguing quite quick. So I like thinking about threshold as the intensity at which, if I run below it, I fatigue relatively slowly. if I run above it, I'm going to fatigue relatively quick. So if for most amateur runners, you think about your 10K pace, if I go faster than my 10K pace, yeah, it starts to get hard a lot quicker. If I run less than my 10K pace, it's a bit easier. I can sustain a bit longer. That's a really nice practical sort of definition without getting too in the ins and outs to the physiological side. It's like for most people, that's pretty intuitive. Ultimately, though, that lactate threshold serves as a marker of or a really good predictor of performance. The higher the velocity or the speed, the pace at which you can run at that threshold, typically is a better indicator of you being able to run a lot quicker and a lot faster. So if I take an athlete with a lactate threshold of 4-minute kilometer pace and someone at 4:30 pace, well, in something like a half marathon or something like a 10K, probably going to see that person with the higher velocity of threshold is going to be more successful. So it is a really solid predictor of performance in a lot of endurance events. But as I alluded to before, it's not the only lactate threshold. There's a very minor one that happens earlier, which is often then just that divider between what's that low intensity, easy stuff and what's becoming a bit more tempo like. So it's kind of solid, easy to solid endurance run to tempo, little sort of change there. Our body starts to go, yeah, this is a bit sort of comfortably uncomfortable, but I can sustain it. That's kind of the first one. And we use that in the lab just to set up those zones. But off a watch, it's like what that's estimating or assessing there is that second one and that more clear definer between I'm going to start fatiguing quite quick. If I stay below this, though, I can sustain it quite long. And if we're seeing improvement or you're seeing increase or increase in the speed there, you're getting faster at that lactate threshold, often it's a good sign that your whole aerobic engine's really starting to develop quite nicely. So hopefully that gives a bit of a simplified breakdown because I appreciate it's like some people might be really interested in the real technical stuff, but some might be like, I still have no idea what he just said.
No, it's like that, isn't it? As you say, there's so much to it technically as well. But no, your overview there is fantastic. It's really good. And yeah, definitely gives us that idea of what we're seeing when we do think about lactate threshold, when we do see it on our watch. And as you say, it's kind of like, is it that 5K, 10K pace? What we can continue to do that. Once we then go above that is when we're going to, as you say, fatigue a lot quicker. And yeah, over a shorter period, not so bad. Over a longer period, yeah, we'll fatigue a lot quicker and not be able to carry on and do those bigger Ks. So no, you've done a fantastic job explaining it. And I love, the breakdowns of what you've done. And just before, obviously, we wrap up the podcast, you've done a massive overview of two of the things probably us runners see a lot when we speak about, our Garmins and what we might see on there. But just talk a little bit about yourself. You're an AFL umpire. So for people that are listening that don't know, AFL is Australian Rules Football. For you being an AFL umpire, obviously you run a lot during the course of a game. So for you, the training that you must go under is obviously very different then as well from just being able to have that lactate threshold, have that VO2 max, for example.
Yeah, it's it is quite different. I think from a training sense, like a lot of our stuff is quite high intensity in nature, very stop start, rather than the longer distance stuff. So I always kind of sort of go, if I was to go and run a 10K, often at times I feel like I'd probably run it better if I ran it as 400-meter repeats, and just had breaks in between. But yeah, so it is quite. I sit a lot of my time in that high intensity sort of space because that's quite specific to the movement patterns and the running we need. But in during the week, I'll still accumulate a good amount of that sort of more traditional zone 2 sort of volume as some extra aerobic work just to make sure I've got a good enough base to get through a 2-hour accumulated game, right? So we're sort of on average about 4 30-minute quarters. So you're spreading that workload over a long period of time. But I think in terms of context, probably the best way I can describe it for most who wouldn't understand the work rate of what we do and that kind of the fitness level. For the average runner, what I'd challenge you to do, if you want to get a bit of a perspective on sort of what it's like, it's kind of like going out and doing a 10K run. We run about 15, 16K total in a game, but I think the physical load of a 10K run at probably a 7 out of 10 best effort. It's not, by the end of the game, you're not so fatigued and exhausted that you're done, but because it's all broken up. But I think if you ran a 10K at sort of 7 out of 10, every week for about 20 to 30 weeks of the year back to back, plus trying to travel to the other side of the country to do it on a 24-hour turnaround. I think that is kind of the physical load. We're we're not hammering ourselves at our PBs every week, but we're on every week.
Yeah.
So you have to turn that around and be ready to perform at your best every 7 days essentially, or sometimes less. But then it's probably the mental load too. We were sort of quickly chatting before we started this episode, but I go, the mental load's probably more the fatiguing part for me. You go and run that 10K. What I'd recommend is go out and do it on a road, on the side of a road where you can read car number plates. So that gives you a bit of idea of like, while you're running at a pretty good pace, your vision's got to be nice and stable so you can see refined detail. But then cognitively, you have to try and assess what's going in front of you. So reading the number plate is a good one. But then add an extra layer of someone running with you and asking you other questions at the same time that you also have to get right. And then the person running the opposite direction who runs past you every so often is just yelling a bit of abuse at you. Like that's a really good picture of what it would be like. So I think like it's different to your average runner. Like I said, I wouldn't make a very good 10K runner or half marathoner or marathoner. I'd be okay, but get me to run a bunch of 50-meter repeats or 50-meter shuttles, and I go pretty good at them. So yeah, different kind of fitness, but still a lot of the same principles. I just probably flip it the opposite. Lots more high intensity, not as much long, slow. For the average marathon runner, it's kind of the other way. Bit of high intensity when we need it, but lots more of the longer, slower stuff or thresholdy sort of stuff. So yeah, hopefully that gives a bit of insight. But yeah, it's good fun. It's not a gig for everyone, but it's I really enjoy it. And it's sort of nice to work in the space and be able to implement the stuff that I do into my own training on the back end. But yeah, it's a nice one to sort of keep me ticking along and keep me pretty fit too. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
No, thanks for sharing that. It's really cool. And yeah, I just can imagine now, just as you were talking there, just thinking to myself, going for that run and trying to read number plates and having someone ask me loads of questions about something else. And then just, randomly people running past me, just hate and abuse. I'd just be like, mentally, you just be like, I don't know if I can do this. I'd probably, be stopping less than every 50 meters. I'd be like, hang on, I just need a break for a second. So thanks for sharing that. It's really cool insight into it as well, what you do. And as I say, for anyone listening, anyone in the Melbourne area, check out Nick and check out Mets Performance Consulting. Really cool. It's great insight into what you guys do. And thank you for sharing those details, because I think as us runners, sometimes we see all these numbers and all these figures, and as you say, you can go on different avenues on social media and they tell you all this other stuff about heart rate zones, VO2 max, lactate threshold, but it's really great to get it from a perspective of yourself, someone that is got extensive research into it and has such great skills in the sports science world.
No, hopefully it was helpful, and we definitely have an emphasis on trying to keep things quite practical. So hopefully everything I sort of mentioned there, and if you thought some of the analogies or things are a bit odd, it's like that's always how I've sort of operated, because it's like the average person who doesn't do what I do probably thinks there's a lot going on, and fair enough too. So anyway, we can help sort of educate a bit and keep it quite simple so runners can actually take some of this information and make it effective in their training. Like that's the important part, right? Like if you're out there and you're beating your PBs and running well and staying injury free, it's like that's the stuff that counts. Like the technicalities of a lactate threshold, for example, is not as important as you breaking your marathon PB. Anyway, we can make it practical and easy to understand. Hopefully that's what I've been able to do a bit here. And if you come in and see us, hopefully that's what we can do for you as well.
No, 100%. You certainly have, and you definitely broke it down and gave us, really good insight into it. And I'm sure, plenty of the viewers and listeners will be definitely tuning in and understand a little bit more after that, and going out and trying some of those runs to improve. And definitely check you guys out. I'm looking forward to catch up with you and get myself tested and see how I am, see how much I compare to the Garmin.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be good to see. Put you to the test, and we'll see how you go. See if you can knock off a few records in the lab.
Awesome. Thanks for joining, Nick. I really appreciate it. And as always, until next time, happy running.